On Christmas Day of 1929, gunshots rang through the stillness of the forest, sharp and haunting. Investigators, alert and tense, followed the echoing sound until they reached a clearing. There, under the shadow of a towering tree, a lifeless body lay sprawled on the ground. Surrounding the tree were footprints, circling in a way that suggested hesitation, as if the person responsible had agonized over this decision. On top of the body, scattered like clues, were handwritten letters. The investigators sifted through them carefully, each note revealing pieces of a story steeped in sorrow. But one letter caught their eye immediately. Written in shaky handwriting, it read, "Blame nobody but I." Welcome to Fridays with Tony, where we explore mysteries that are unusual, unsettling, and often unsolved. I'm Tony, and every other Friday we have new stories to unravel with you. Like and subscribe to be sure you don't miss any of our explorations into the unknown. This week, we are exploring 4 Yuletide tales that may have you listening for more than the sound of reindeer on Christmas Eve night. It all started in the quiet hills of Lawsonville, North Carolina, on May 10th, 1886, when Charles Davis Lawson was born to Augustus and Nancy Lawson. Nestled deep within the agrarian landscape of Stokes County, their home was like any other in the rural South, humble, surrounded by fields, and built on the sweat of honest labor. The Lawsons weren't wealthy, but they knew the land, living off its gifts and through its hardships. Their life revolved around the endless cycles of farming that defined the region. Charles grew up with dirt under his fingernails and the endless North Carolina fields stretching as far as he could see. Farming wasn't just work. It was survival, a way of life passed down through generations. And when Charles was 25, he knew he was ready to settle down. That's when he met Fanny Mannering, a young woman 6 years his junior, born in 1892. She was kind and steady, qualities that Charles needed. For life in Lawsonville wasn't easy. Together, they embarked on a journey that would lead them to a life no one could have predicted. In 1911, Charles and Fanny married and began their family. They quickly fell into the rhythm of rural life, welcoming their first daughter Maureen in 1912. With each new child that followed, Arthur, William, Carrie, Maybelle, James, Raymond, and finally Mary Lou, their family grew, and so did the workload. But there was no time to dwell on how hard life was. They just worked. Their days blurred together with farming chores, tending to the land and livestock, and the quiet hope of a better future. But something terrible happened in 1920, an event that would haunt the family. Their third child, little William, was taken by illness at only 6 years old. The loss carved a deep wound in their lives, but they couldn't stop. They had other mouths to feed and other lives to nurture, so they pushed on, finding ways to cope through the rhythm of work and routine. In 1918, Charles saw a glimmer of opportunity. His brothers Marion and Elijah had moved to Germantown, a nearby area where the land promised better prospects. With their encouragement, Charles packed up his family and followed his brothers, hoping that the move might bring them a step closer to stability. There, the Lawsons became tenant tobacco farmers. It wasn't much. They didn't own the land, and a portion of their crops went straight to the landlord, but it was enough to keep the dream alive. Yet Charles had a drive that wouldn't settle for tenant farming forever. The family worked tirelessly, every member doing their part. The children joined in, their small hands learning the rough work of tobacco farming alongside their parents. They saved and sacrificed, and somehow, by 1927, Charles had scraped together enough to buy a farm of his own on Brook Cove Road in Germantown. Owning land was more than just a purchase. It was a victory, a declaration that they had made it, that they were finally rooted. Their new life on the farm was relentless, demanding endless hours in the fields and more tobacco seasons than they could count. Charles, Fanny, and the children worked side by side, their lives intertwined with the very soil that sustained them. This was a family that endured, day by day, in a world where nothing came easy, and every comfort was hard-earned. The community saw the Lawsons as devoted, uncomplaining people. They were the family that others could look up to. Yet, behind the scenes, the burdens weighed heavily on Charles and Fanny, but they kept pushing forward, unaware that they were marching toward a chapter that would alter everything. As they toiled through one season after another, few could have guessed what lay ahead. A darkness that would engulf this steadfast family, turning their story into one that the people of Stokes County would remember for generations. It was Christmas 1929, and Lawsonville, North Carolina was settling into a quiet holiday. But for Charles Lawson, a man of 43, things were far from calm. Just days before the holiday, he took an unusual step. He gathered his wife, Fanny, and their 7 children, dressing them up in freshly bought clothes. They made the trip into town to have a family portrait taken, a rare indulgence for hard-working farmers in those days. For those who knew the Lawsons, it seemed strange, almost out of character. After all, families in their rural community rarely splurged on such luxuries. This act, though, hinted at something far darker than anyone could have suspected. Charles Lawson was a well-known figure in the area. He'd scraped together enough to buy his own farm, a rare achievement for a tenant tobacco farmer. By most accounts, he was doing well enough that neighbors might have understood a holiday treat for his family. But as people would later piece together, this Christmas portrait was no ordinary photo. Rumors spread that Lawson had harbored secrets that threatened to rip apart the very fabric of his family. Some even speculated after the fact that his own daughter Maureen was bearing his child, though such a horror seemed almost beyond belief. Then came Christmas Day. The Lawson family had finished their preparations, and in the crisp winter air there was no warning of the horror about to unfold. Charles sent his eldest son, 19-year-old Arthur, on an errand into town. Nobody thought much of it at the time, though later, people would wonder if Charles had orchestrated it in order to ensure that at least one of his children would survive what he was about to do. As the day wore on, Charles's 2 young daughters, 12-year-old Carrie and 7-year-old Maybelle, set off down the road to visit their aunt and uncle. They hadn't gotten far when Charles, lurking by the tobacco barn, saw them coming. With a 12-gauge shotgun in hand, he waited. In one swift, brutal moment, he raised the gun and fired, ending their lives instantly. But Charles was meticulous. He moved close to ensure they were gone, bludgeoning them as if the gunshot alone hadn't been enough. When he was certain, he carefully arranged their bodies in the barn, almost as if they were lying at rest. From there, he turned back toward his house, where Fanny was on the porch, likely unaware of what had just happened to her daughters. As she turned to look at him, he raised the shotgun once more. The shot echoed through the air, and Fanny fell, lifeless, on the porch she'd walked across so many times before. Inside the house, Marie, his 17-year-old daughter, heard the blast. She screamed in horror as the reality of what was happening dawned on her. Her younger brothers, James and Raymond, scrambled in panic, trying to find a place to hide, any corner that might shield them from their father's rage. But Charles entered the house like a storm, single-minded and unyielding. He shot Marie, his eldest daughter, ending her cries. Then he found James and Raymond, their small bodies trembling with fear. He killed them too, one by one, ensuring that no one would be left to witness his monstrous deeds. In the silence that followed, only the baby, 4-month-old Mary Lou, remained. There is no record of how he faced her, but those who later examined the scene believed she had been bludgeoned, her life extinguished in a heartbeat. By the time Charles finished his massacre, an eerie silence hung over the house. The once bustling family home, filled with the sound of children's laughter and holiday preparation, was now a place of unthinkable tragedy. But Charles wasn't done. He walked into the nearby woods, disappearing among the trees that had watched over his family for so many years. Hours passed, and by then, news of the Lawson tragedy had spread like wildfire through Stokes County. Neighbors, horrified by what they'd heard, gathered around the property, watching in stunned silence. Then, out of the quiet, a gunshot rang through the trees. The crowd knew what it meant. A police officer, who had arrived to witness the devastation, rushed into the woods with Arthur, Charles's eldest son, by his side. There, under a towering tree, they found him. A shotgun lay beside his body, and around the base of the tree were tracks that told a haunting story. Charles had paced in circles, round and round, wrestling with his thoughts before, finally, ending it all. Beside him, they found letters to his parents, as if he hoped to explain the unexplainable. But no letter could ever justify what he had done. The scene that unfolded on the Lawson property that Christmas Day would forever haunt the people of Lawsonville. A dark shadow cast over a holiday meant for joy. And as the years went by, people spoke in hushed tones about that infamous family portrait, the one taken days before, showing the family united, even as their world teetered on the edge of ruin. Theories about what drove Charles Lawson to commit such a horrendous act swirled in the aftermath of the tragedy, and each explanation seemed darker than the last. Friends and family whispered that Charles had not been the same since a head injury months earlier. Some claimed it had rattled him so deeply that he began showing signs of a disturbed mind. Perhaps, they speculated, his head injury had pushed him over the edge. But when doctors at Johns Hopkins Hospital examined his brain, they found nothing unusual. No damage that could explain the madness that unfolded that Christmas. So if it wasn't the injury, what was it? In the 1990s, more than 60 years after the murders, a chilling new theory surfaced, one that added a sinister twist to an already horrifying story. A book titled White Christmas, Bloody Christmas revealed an anonymous tip, a hushed-up rumor that Charles had been abusing his 17-year-old daughter Marie. The day before the book's release, the author received a phone call from a relative named Stella Lawson, who had already been interviewed for the book. Stella recounted a family conversation she'd overheard, a conversation among Fanny's sisters-in-law and aunts. According to Stella, Fanny had confided to them that she suspected her husband, Charles, had an incestuous relationship with Marie. The family had been carrying the dark secret for years, and Fanny had been suspicious since at least early 1928, a year and a half before the massacre. Then, as if the revelations couldn't get more twisted, another disturbing piece of the puzzle emerged. In 2006, the same author published the meaning of our tears, revealing even more horrifying details. Marie's close friend Ella May came forward with her own account, claiming that just weeks before that tragic Christmas, Marie had confessed to her. Marie had said that she was pregnant, and the father, she alleged, was none other than Charles himself. Ella May said both Charles and Fanny knew about the pregnancy, a secret that may have been simmering within the family, eventually boiling over into murder. Another close friend of the Lawsons, a neighbor named Hill Hampton, hinted that he too knew of the serious problems within the family, though he refused to elaborate. But by then, suspicions had taken root in the community. Could this twisted, shameful secret have driven Charles to kill his entire family, to bury the truth forever? In the aftermath of the massacre, Charles's brother Marion made a bold decision. He turned the family home on Brook Cove Road into a public spectacle, charging curious visitors to walk through the very place where the tragedy had occurred. One eerie relic on display was a cake Marie had baked on Christmas Day, a haunting reminder of the normalcy that had been shattered. Visitors began picking raisins off the cake as morbid souvenirs until it had to be placed under a glass cover, preserving it as a strange keepsake of that fateful day. The Lawson murders became an unsettling piece of folk legend, inspiring ballads and songs that preserved the horror in mournful lyrics. The haunting murder ballad, The Murder of the Lawson Family, was recorded by the Carolina Buddies in 1930 and covered by the Stanley Brothers decades later. The gruesome case was even featured in an episode of the PRX podcast Criminal, where listeners were taken through the chilling details of that Christmas tragedy. In the years that followed, the family's memory remained both mourned and mythologized. Charles Lawson and his family were laid to rest in a family graveyard, with a tombstone marked by the square and compass symbol. Many assumed Charles had been a Freemason, but it turned out he belonged to the Junior Order of United American Mechanics, a group with a similar emblem. Arthur Lawson, the sole surviving family member, tried to move on with his life, though the shadow of that Christmas never truly left him. In 1945, Arthur's life ended in a car accident at just 35 years old, leaving behind his wife and 4 children. Now, I know this story sounds like it's straight out of a horror movie, but did you know that horror related to the holiday season isn't exactly a rare phenomenon? Christmas in England is nothing like the warm, twinkling holiday traditions many of us know. The Brits have their quirks, a festive vernacular that swaps Merry Christmas for Happy Crimbo, the donning of colorful paper crowns during Christmas dinner, and desserts like Christmas pudding instead of the pecan pie Americans might cherish. But perhaps the most surprising of all is their penchant for ghost stories during the Yuletide season. And I'm about to tell you one of these stories that will definitely send chills down your spine. The Legend of the Mistletoe Bride. A man had his own brush with this haunting legend unexpectedly on a cold, damp evening in Charleston, and he shared what went down with the world. This man was wandering through his favorite antique store when he stumbled upon it, a painting so grand and eerie that it stopped him in his tracks. It was enormous, covering nearly the entire wall, at least 8 by 6 feet. The oil painting commanded attention, not only for its size, but for its haunting subject. The bride stared back at him, frozen in time. She was young, beautiful, and full of life. her face lit with a mischievous cheer that betrayed no hint of the tragedy to come. Her veil, adorned with a wreath of mistletoe, cascaded around her, framing her as she tentatively lifted the lid of an imposing oak trunk. The darkened attic behind her hinted at the shadows of the tale, a story he recognized instantly. He knew how this story ended, and it was hard not to grimace, imagining how disturbing the story was. The shopkeeper, intrigued by his reaction, asked if he knew the story. Over a steaming cup of tea, he shared the tale that had both enchanted and unnerved Victorian England. The legend of the Mistletoe Bride begins on Christmas Eve, in a grand castle bathed in candlelight and adorned with the festive spirit. The young couple, glowing with newlywed bliss, decided to inject a little playful cheer into their wedding celebrations with a game of hide and seek. The groom, being the gentleman he was, agreed to be it, giving the guests and his bride time to hide within the many nooks and crannies of the sprawling estate. The bride, fiercely competitive, saw this as an opportunity to shine once more on her special day. She slipped away from the laughter and chatter, her gown trailing softly behind her, until she reached the attic. Amid the clutter and shadows, she spotted an old oak chest, its heavy lid beckoning her with the promise of a perfect hiding spot. With some effort, she lifted the lid and climbed inside, her delicate fingers carefully pulling her gown in behind her. She lowered the lid, confident her hiding place would ensure her victory. But then, the lid clicked shut, the heavy metal lock sealing her inside. Downstairs, the merriment continued, the groom eagerly seeking out his bride and their guests bursting into peals of laughter as they were discovered one by one. But as the minutes turned into hours, a chilling realization began to settle over the group. The bride was nowhere to be found. The groom's joy turned to desperation as he called out her name, his voice echoing through the grand halls. Guests searched tirelessly through the night, combing every corner of the castle. But no matter how many places they looked, there was no sign of the bride. Days turned into weeks, and the hope of finding her faded. The castle, once a place of celebration, became shrouded in sorrow. The groom, heartbroken, lived out his days in the shadow of her mysterious disappearance. Years later, long after the tragedy had slipped into whispered legend, the castle passed on to another family. The new occupants began the arduous task of clearing out the attic, rummaging through old furniture and forgotten relics. It was then that they found an ancient oak chest. When the lid was pried open, the grim secret was finally revealed. Inside lay the skeletal remains of the bride, her veil still draped over her crumbling bones. The mistletoe wreath, a haunting reminder of the life that had been snuffed out too soon. The story, morbid as it was, struck a chord with Victorian England. It was immortalized in Thomas Haynes Bailey's ballad, The Mistletoe Bough, in the early 1830s, with verses that chilled listeners to the bone. Oh, sad was her fate, in sportive jest. She hid from her lord in the old oak chest. It closed with a spring and dreadful doom. The bride lay clasped in her living tomb. The ballad became a Christmas staple, sung in households across England. It wasn't just a tale of horror. It was a cautionary story wrapped in Gothic romanticism. So pervasive was its popularity that numerous English castles and stately homes began to claim the story as their own. Bramshill House, Marwell Hall, Castle Horneck, Basildon Grotto, and Minster Lovel Hall all became contenders for the setting of the tragedy, each boasting a chest said to be the bride's final resting place. Even ruins such as those at Minster Lovel Hall drew visitors eager to connect with the macabre tale. The Mistletoe Bride story didn't stop at the ballad. It inspired plays, short stories, and even films. Henry James drew on its themes in his 1868 short story, The Romance of Certain Old Clothes. Filmmakers in the early 20th century brought the bride's tale to life on screen, with versions appearing in 1904, 1923, and 1926. Even Alfred Hitchcock paid homage to the legend in his 1948 film Rope. In one chilling scene, the protagonist recounts a tale of a woman hidden in a chest, unaware that a dead body lies concealed in a trunk mere feet away. The bride story also found a place in modern literature, reinterpreted by Kate Moss in her 2013 collection, The Mistletoe Bride and Other Haunting Tales. It seems the legend refuses to fade, its haunting allure continuing to captivate audiences. But there's another legend, just like this one, that will make you wonder just how sinister this joyful holiday can really get. The haunting legacy of Anne Boleyn. There's something unshakably eerie about ancient spaces. Their walls seem to hum with untold stories, and their floors creak as though they remember every footstep that ever crossed them. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, was a woman of unparalleled influence and ambition. Her life was a whirlwind of love, politics, betrayal, and tragedy. In her rise, she captured the heart of a king and altered the course of English history. In her fall, she became a symbol of injustice. But Anne's story doesn't end with her death. In fact, for many, it's only the beginning. The Tower of London, that imposing fortress of power and despair, holds a tragic place in Anne Boleyn's story. It was here, on May 19, 1536, that Anne met her untimely end. Convicted of false charges of adultery and treason, she was beheaded with a single stroke of a French sword. Her death was swift, but unjust, leaving an indelible scar on English history. Many believe that Anne never truly left the tower. One of the most chilling accounts comes from a captain of the guard who, late one night, noticed an unusual flickering light inside the locked Chapel Royal. Curious and cautious, he climbed a ladder to peer through a window. What he saw was beyond comprehension. A silent procession of knights and ladies, dressed in ancient finery, gliding through the chapel as if reenacting a scene from the past. Leading the group was a regal woman whose figure bore an uncanny resemblance to Anne Boleyn, as depicted in her portraits. Just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures faded into nothingness, leaving the captain shaken but certain of what he had seen. Years later, in 1864, another guard had an even more terrifying encounter. While patrolling near the lieutenant's lodgings, he confronted a pale, spectral figure. When the figure didn't respond to his challenge, he lunged forward with his bayonet, only to have it pass straight through the apparition. The ghostly figure disappeared without a sound, leaving the guard trembling. An officer watching from a nearby window reportedly witnessed the entire episode, confirming the chilling event. What compels Anne's spirit, or her imprint, to return to the tower? Is it a search for justice, or is her presence merely a reflection of the emotional turmoil she endured in her final days? If the tower marks Anne's tragic end, Hever Castle represents the bright beginning of her story. This was her childhood home, a place where she laughed, learned, and grew into the sharp-witted woman who would, one day, captivate a king. It was here, under the sprawling branches of a great oak tree, that Anne and Henry VIII first courted, their whispered promises of love entwined with the rustling leaves. To this day, Hever Castle is said to host Anne's ghost, particularly during the Christmas season. Locals claim to have seen her beneath that same oak tree, her figure standing still as though lost in thought. Others have reported spotting her crossing the bridge over the River Eden, her pale form blending with the winter mist. Unlike the haunting stories of the tower, Anne's presence at Hever seems more melancholic than menacing, a quiet return to a place that once held her happiest memories. On the other hand, Windsor Castle, the world's oldest and largest occupied castle, has its own share of ghostly tales, but few are as unsettling as those of Anne Boleyn. In the Dean's Cloister, she has been seen standing at a window, her gaze fixed on something unseen. Is she searching for solace, or perhaps reflecting on the life she left behind? Even more disturbing are the reports of Anne running down a corridor, her screams echoing through the halls. In some accounts, she is clutching her severed head, a grotesque reminder of her violent end. The sheer horror of these stories raises questions. Why would a woman of such dignity and grace appear in such a tormented form? Are these manifestations merely the echoes of collective imagination, or is there something more to them? We've got Hampton Court, with its magnificent Tudor architecture, which was once a stage for Anne's triumphs and struggles. Here, she basked in the glow of royal favor and endured the relentless pressures of court life. It's said that her ghost still lingers in these halls, dressed in a blue or black gown, moving with the elegance of a queen who refuses to be forgotten. Yet some accounts take a darker turn. Witnesses have reported seeing Anne as a headless figure, her form gliding through the corridors, as if searching for something or someone. The sight is enough to unnerve even the most skeptical of visitors. Rochford Hall in Essex holds a special place in Anne's story. It is believed to be the site where Henry VIII first laid eyes on her, igniting a connection that would forever alter the course of English history. The Boleyn family owned the manor, and it's said that Henry and Anne held secret meetings here, away from the watchful eyes of court. Beneath the manor, rumors speak of hidden tunnels that allowed Henry to visit discreetly. Today, tales of a headless lady and icy cold spots in certain rooms fuel speculation. Could Anne's ghost be returning to the place where her destiny began, or is it merely the weight of history playing tricks on the imagination? Perhaps the most macabre of all the stories associated with Anne takes place at Blicking Hall in Norfolk. Every year on the anniversary of her execution, locals claim to witness a chilling sight. A phantom carriage, drawn by headless horses and driven by a headless coachman, arrives at the hall. Inside the carriage sits Anne, clutching her severed head. As the carriage vanishes into the night, Anne is said to wander the corridors and grounds until sunrise. The imagery is almost too grotesque to believe, yet it has persisted for centuries. Now, let me take you to France to explore another Christmas legend to keep you on your toes. The legend of Hans Trapp. Hans Trapp was, in life, a man of immense wealth and power, his status towering over those around him as surely as his imposing height. By all accounts, he was close to 2 meters tall. A giant of a man whose presence was as formidable as his reputation. But behind the grand estates and opulent lifestyle lay a heart blackened by greed, cruelty, and vanity. He cared for nothing but his own gain, amassing fortune through dark and dubious means. Whispers spread through the villages that his wealth was not earned, but conjured. That Hans Trapp had turned to the occult, forging pacts with demons and worshipping Satan himself to achieve his ambitions. The church, ever watchful for signs of heresy and blasphemy, could not ignore such rumors. When news of Trapp's deeds reached the Vatican, it sparked outrage. A man who flaunted his allegiance to darkness could not be allowed to continue unchecked. He was arrested and brought before the Pope to answer for his sins. The trial was swift and damning. For his unholy practices and defiance of the church, Hans Trapp was excommunicated, cast out from the faith, and his soul condemned. This was not just a spiritual punishment, but a societal death sentence, stripping him of his power and isolating him from the world he once dominated. Returning to France in disgrace, Hans Trapp found himself a man without a country. His lands and property were seized and his castles confiscated. The villages he had once lorded over now turned their backs on him, treating him with contempt and fear. Banished from his home, he retreated to the dense, shadowy forests near the German border. Here, far from the civilization that had cast him out, Hans Trapp began to change. The isolation gnawed at him, and his hatred festered, growing darker and more twisted with each passing day. The man who had once reveled in his wealth now lived like a wild animal, consumed by thoughts of vengeance against those who had wronged him. Alone in the forest, he delved deeper into the occult, his studies of demonology and dark magic becoming an obsession. But his anger soon gave way to something far more monstrous. As the months turned into years, Hans Trapp began to crave something unimaginable: human flesh. This horrifying hunger took hold of his mind, driving him to devise a plan so grotesque it would cement his place in the annals of terror. Hans Trapp, the once proud nobleman, transformed himself into a figure of nightmares. He fashioned a disguise, dressing as a scarecrow, with ragged clothing stuffed with straw. His twisted plan was simple, yet horrifying. He would hide in the fields, motionless and unassuming, waiting for his unsuspecting prey. The forest that had been his prison now became his hunting ground, and his descent into madness was complete. One day, a young shepherd boy wandered through the fields near Hans Trapp's lair. The boy, unaware of the danger lurking nearby, walked closer to the strange, lifeless figure standing amongst the crops. Then, with terrifying speed, Hans Trapp sprung to life. Wielding a sharpened stick, he attacked the boy with a ferocity born of his madness. the child never stood a chance. Hans Trapp dragged the lifeless body back to his crude dwelling in the woods, his anticipation building with every step. Inside his shack, Hans Trapp butchered the boy's body, preparing to indulge in his horrifying craving. But just as he was about to take his first bite of human flesh, the heavens intervened. A bolt of lightning struck him dead, its blinding light filling the forest as if God himself had passed judgment. Hans Trapp fell, lifeless, to the ground, his skull cracking against the wooden table. His monstrous plans, forever unfinished. But death was not the end for Hans Trapp. The villagers, already terrified of the man in life, began to whisper that his spirit lingered, refusing to leave the land that had cast him out. Over time, his legend grew. Parents began to tell their children that Hans Trapp's ghost returned every Christmas season, dressed as a scarecrow, waiting to snatch misbehaving children and drag them into the forest, never to be seen again. He became a cautionary tale, a specter of fear used to enforce good behavior. The legend didn't stop there. In some versions of the tale, Hans Trapp's fate took a bizarre twist. It is said that Saint Nicholas himself, the beloved figure of generosity and kindness, took pity on Trapp's damned soul. Much like the figure of Krampus, Hans Trapp was bound by Saint Nicholas and forced to accompany him on his holiday rounds. While Saint Nicholas rewarded the good children, Hans Trapp was tasked with punishing the wicked. This strange partnership added a layer of complexity to the legend, turning Hans Trapp from a solitary terror into a reluctant enforcer of morality. But every legend, no matter how fantastical, has a kernel of truth. And in the case of Hans Trapp, that truth is rooted in history. Hans von Trotha, the real man behind the myth, was a knight and marshal who lived during the late 15th century. Hans von Trotha owned two castles, Berwartstein and Grafendon, located near the Palatinate Forest, a region straddling the borders of France and Germany. Hans von Trotha's life was full of conflict and controversy. A bitter dispute with the Benedictine monks of Weissenberg Abbey over the ownership of Berwartstein Castle escalated into a feud of epic proportions. When the abbot refused to yield his claim, Hans von Trotha retaliated by ordering a dam to be constructed, cutting off the water supply to the nearby village. The villagers suffered greatly, their livelihoods thrown into chaos. Then, in a cruel twist, Hans von Trotha ordered the dam to be destroyed, flooding the village and causing widespread devastation. The conflict drew the attention of Emperor Maximilian I of Germany and Pope Innocent VIII. Summoned to answer for his actions, Hans von Trotha refused to appear before the Pope, instead penning a scathing letter accusing the Church of corruption. His defiance earned him excommunication and an imperial ban, stripping him of his titles and marking him as an outlaw. Despite this, Hans von Trotha found favor with King Louis XII of France, who awarded him the title of Chevalier d'Or, or Knight of Gold. Hans von Trotha lived out his final years in relative peace, dying of natural causes. But history has a way of transforming reality into legend. Hans von Trotha became Hans Trapp, a figure of terror whose story was shaped by the fears and imaginations of the people. From a ruthless knight to a demonic scarecrow, his transformation speaks to the power of folklore and its ability to amplify the darkest aspects of human nature. Today, the legend of Hans Trapp endures in the Palatinate region and beyond. His name is whispered in the same breath as Krampus, another dark figure of Christmas lore. The dark and twisted counterpart to St. Nicholas has terrified children and fascinated folklore enthusiasts for centuries. In the Alpine traditions of Central and Eastern Europe, Krampus is a horned anthropomorphic figure who punishes misbehaving children during the Christmas season. On December 5th, the night before St. Nicholas's feast day, Krampus roams the streets during Krampus night. While St. Nicholas rewards good children with gifts, Krampus wields a birch rod to scare or punish the naughty ones. The creature's grotesque appearance, part goat, part demon, makes him an unforgettable figure in holiday lore. The origins of Krampus are mysterious, but many believe the figure has pre-Christian roots, tied to pagan traditions in the Alpine regions. Early depictions feature Krampus with horns, a long tongue, and cloven hooves, carrying chains and bells to symbolize his servitude to the Christian Church. Over time, he became St. Nicholas's dark enforcer, ensuring that children's behavior was kept in check. Krampus's terrifying image has endured through the ages. In some parts of Europe, masked figures parade through towns in events like the Krampus Run, where costumed Krampuses playfully menace onlookers. Traditional Krampus greeting cards have depicted him as a fearsome creature, looming over terrified children or mischievously chasing women. Modern interpretations, however, have softened Krampus's image, transforming him into a humorous or even whimsical character. The legend has been revived in recent decades, with Krampus becoming a popular figure in global culture. Despite his terrifying role, Krampus remains an enduring symbol of the darker side of holiday traditions. And together, all of these stories remind us that not all Christmas tales are merry and bright. Of course, the case of the Lawson family murders was not a mere story. The tragedy actually happened and affected the lives of countless people around them. Thanks for unraveling these unmerry mysteries with me. Be sure to like and subscribe because we always have new tales to tell on Fridays with Tony. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.